Well, I'm here to talk to you today about education, and I know you know because Robert Welch knew it. We heard from Jack how dear and central education was to the life of Robert Welch. It was education that made him into what he was, and education is the foundation of a free republic. We know the Founding Fathers made it absolutely clear, unless we were both a moral and an educated people, this republic would not stand. Morality's been eroded for quite a while now, and now the progressive anarchists have gotten around to really taking apart our education. If you think about one episode that's on everybody's radar screen right now, you think about the Kavanaugh nomination. There is no aspect of the Kavanaugh fiasco that is not promulgated by universities. It happens first in universities. I've been a professor of humanities, a professor of English, Shakespeare, for about 25 years. And 15, 20 years ago, we all used to laugh about the goofy things professors did. Now what you're seeing, and I think the Kavanaugh experience is an absolute watershed in American history. What passed for silliness in universities is now mainstream politics in the Democrat Party. You think about what Kavanaugh has had to go through. He defends himself from allegations of rape and gang rape where there is not a single shred of credible evidence. And when he defends himself with passion, he is said not to have a temperament for the Supreme Court. When he is brought to tears by the effect this outrage has inflicted on his little 10-year-old daughter, his tears are called evidence of frat boy white privilege. You stop and think about what's happening with the Democrats and this Kavanaugh nomination. They are basically arguing now that evidence is not necessary to convict a man of rape. That is the hill they're dying on. You are to believe all women, regardless if there is no evidence whatsoever. They're telling him he should stand down and shut up and not defend himself. They are telling him that to defend himself is proof that he is a rapist. All of these odd locutions began in universities. I teach in universities. I've taught in 7 different universities. I've taught in the South, I've taught in the Midwest, I've taught on the East Coast, I've taught in branch campuses, I've taught in big research universities, and it's the same all over the place. What they're doing to your boys on college campuses, what you're seeing with Judge Kavanaugh, that's what they're teaching your boys when they set foot on campus. That masculinity is by definition toxic. That to be a male on a college campus is to be an oppressor, is to be complicit in rape culture. What we see, and I've lived with this for 10 years, I've almost gotten kind of used to that now, as wicked as it is. It's such a part of the academy for the last 15 or 20 years. They're telling your kids, you're telling your kids that if they're white, they are guilty of white privilege, which means they are complicit in race, regardless of what is in their heads or their hearts. It does not matter if they have never uttered a racist word or had a racist thought. Their skin color makes them complicit in racism. If they are heterosexual, what universities cleverly now called cisgendered, if they are heterosexual, they participate in marginalizing they call it heteronormativity, the participation in freezing out all alternate sexual articulations, and of course the gender, right? Modern university campuses are staggering. You have science programs, which are the hallmark of Western culture. You stop and think about it. The advances in Western literature, art, all the great arts and sciences are fantastic. But when you think about Western culture, certainly over the last 200 years, we think of the march of science and progress in terms of our material welfare and what we're able to do, putting a man on the moon. You go to a college campus today, they will be told, and they will be told in their biology classes, that absolute male and female, the only genders that can be verified by science, are actually social constructs that don't exist. But 76 different made-up gender amalgams between male and female are absolutely true, and if you don't believe it, you're a bigot. Don't forget about a year ago, the young student at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, a biology student, a sophomore, who was taking a big biology class for his major, and his professor, a feminist, started lecturing him in biology and the whole class that to argue that male and female can be found in the natural world is a bigoted lie. This sophomore, with more brains perhaps than common sense, stood up and said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is biology, and the biology textbook you assigned us only talks about male and female. She ordered him silent. She got him removed from the class. She got him kicked out of his dorm. And she got him this close to being expelled simply for expressing that sentiment until the national media took hold of this and they were forced to back down and allow this kid back into school with a warning, you can't say those things anymore. That's where we are. And you think about what Kavanaugh's going through. This is not now an academic, the statement, right? It's purely academic. These university professors, they do matter. And what they're formulating to your kids is what you're seeing now at the highest levels of American government. If nobody, pun intended, flakes out between now and tomorrow, Brett Kavanaugh will be the next Supreme Court justice. And that is a wonderful thing. But give the progressive left 5 more years, and do you think we'll be able to elect another one? A man who has a distinguished judicial record, a man who has served the courts in almost, from a conservative perspective, too balanced a way. He's one of those guys that will, good for him. If the Constitution breaks a certain way, it doesn't matter if it benefits conservatives or liberals. He's going to adhere to the Constitution. It's wonderful. But he's going to win by probably 1 vote. 35-year-old accusations from porn trial lawyers with not a shred of evidence. And the entire Democrat House, with one exception, Senate, is going to vote for him. They'll vote against him. Would vote to hold him out of office. It's a staggering thing when you think about that. We expect this kind of stuff on college campuses. We know that Barack Obama's Title IX letter 4 or 5 years ago to the schools now makes it possible for universities to discriminate due process against boys on college campuses. You're a boy on a college campus and you get accused of sexual harassment, you have no right to confront your accuser. You have no right to see the evidence marshaled against you. You don't even have a right to personally defend yourself from the allegations. We've seen over the course of the last 6 months, 93 times in the last 6 months, boys who have been denied due process on campus after 3 and 4 and 5 years of being expelled, having their names dragged through the mud, having their academic careers suspended, have won in court 93 times in the last 6 months. These kids have had to go off campus into federal courts where they can finally get their names back, if you can get your name back. Brett Kavanaugh's not. You know what the left-wing media is going to do. For the next 40 years he's on the bench, he's going to be rapist Brett Kavanaugh. He's going to be ineligible Brett. They're going to keep saying, they're still saying it about Clarence Thomas, all right? So what I'd like to do today is show you some of these things, give you some insight as to what's going on in college campuses, maybe even a little advice here and there about what we can do to battle it. And it starts with this. Are you sure you want to send your kids to college? If your kids are white or heterosexual or if they are males, they're at a major disadvantage on college campuses now. We talk about equity and we talk about social justice. For every 3 boys that go to college, there are 6 girls who go. Can you imagine if you had a disparity like this? 6 boys for every 3 girls? It would be a national outrage. 80% of scholarships at the undergraduate level go to girls. And I have no problem rewarding smart girls, hardworking girls, but the disproportionality here. You are getting, at the Ivy League universities, the #1 category by which scholarships are handed out is not academic performance. It is about alternative genders and sexualities. The #1 way to get a scholarship to any of the Ivy League schools is simply to check the other box when it comes to your sexual affiliation. And colleges and universities are now asking your kids when they apply to talk about their gender, to talk about their sexuality affiliations. It is pretty staggering when you think about it. So are you sure? There are many ways to get kids educated, and there are many ways kids can find meaningful careers. If you're aware of the number, American school kids, graduates of college, from the ages of about 22 to 35, have $1.2 trillion of student loan debt. They're never going to pay that back. People forget that under the Obama administration, one of the very first things Barack Obama did in 2008 when he became president, before he did anything else, was to federalize the student loan program. Because, see, the federal government gives loans to anybody for any reason. So your son wants to be a double major in underwater women's studies and basket weaving. by law, he has to get as much money as your daughter who wants to be an engineer. Even though your daughter, the engineer, is going to be able to pay it back. Your son's not. And so Barack Obama stepped in and said, it's not fair that we're giving engineers and physicists and doctors this kind of money to go to medical school, and we're giving feminists and sociologists less. So our kids now are majoring in things that aren't going to get them hired. Our kids now are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Our kids now, study in the news just yesterday, right? More than 54% of millennials identify as either socialist or Democrat socialist. It's not 20%, it's not 40%, it is a solid majority, 54+%, identify as socialists. 55% of millennials believe in astrology. Less than 35% believe in God. These are staggering numbers. We may eke out a one-vote victory with Brett Kavanaugh, but you see the writing on the wall. Within a generation, what happens as the millennials start having their own kids? And this whole setup for the student loans, the federal government was doing these kids no favors by giving them these loans that they couldn't pay back. Because what happens now, you get a Alexandria Cortez-Ortiz, or you get a Bernie Sanders or a Hillary Clinton. Now, we, the federal government, got you kids in debt by majoring in things that you can't afford to pay for your life. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, in the name of socialism, waive your student loan debt. Right? If Hillary had not kneecapped Bernie Sanders, it's quite likely that Bernie might have beaten Trump on the basis of millennials who would have been promised a complete waiving of the record. There are many, many warning signs on the horizon. These have all been plucked this year. Just a couple of stories taken fresh from the headlines to give you a sense of where universities are. And you're going to see, by the way, in these stories, just how Democrat politicians at every level, and alarmingly at the highest levels, are now using this in things like the Kavanaugh investigation. Well, a university policy which would now punish incorrect use of gender pronouns. If you call somebody he or she, and they don't identify as he or she, you could lose your job if you're a tenured professor at University of Minnesota. University of Minnesota is currently considering, and they have passed part of it, a new policy that would mandate that students and professors use preferred pronouns when addressing colleagues and classmates. Failure to adhere to the requirement would carry penalties up to and including expulsion or termination of employment. And University of Michigan is contemplating a rule that you have to call students whatever they tell you they want to be called. Anything at all, including vulgarities if that's what they want. The mandating of speech here, right? Professor's novel about true love story between an adult man and an underage boy, the next sexual taboo. We've gotten homosexual marriage, we've gotten transgenderism normalized, we've got boys and girls locker rooms and shower. Now is the age issue, right? If we are telling children that they are empowered, if we are now teaching elementary school kids about transgender realities, if we're asking 7-year-olds to identify their genders, we cannot be surprised that now, if we're sexualizing kids in elementary school, you can't then tell them they're not allowed to have sex. It makes sense, right? I don't know if you saw the horrifying story. I think it was from New York. An adult teacher was having sexual relations with a 14-year-old boy, often in the classroom in a New York school. For that, she was given a 10-month suspended sentence, and she got to keep her teaching license. She was more than twice his age. And you can see how the courts are beginning to reflect this, right? If we're sexualizing little kids, if we're treating kids as adults, if we're feeding kids adult sexual information and advice and giving them not just the biology of sex, but sexual mores, overcoming sexual taboos in the school, which is what we're doing, how can we be surprised? Professor writes a novel about a love story between an adult man and an underage boy, and it says, quote, when asked about his book, University of Montana, I do want us to consider who is entitled to tap into the joys of love. What parameters the heteronormative adult world has put around that privilege. You see, it's all your fault, you heterosexuals. You assume that little kids are little kids, and you assume that heterosexuality is the only way to enjoy love. And so the fact that we can't have adult men and underage boy relationships is because of, there's the word I hit you with before, heteronormativity, right? Campus Women's Center offers support for chest feeding. See, to say that breastfeeding is something that women do discriminates against men who think they're women. So now, money is being spent at Northern Colorado University to provide lactation services for men who think they're women. But you can't call it breastfeeding. I'm a man who thinks I'm a woman. Don't you dare call breastfeeding what I want to do. That's sexist. I'm a man after all, but I'm a breastfeeding man, so you got to call it chest feeding so that we have equal terms, right? How much of your kids' tuition dollars? I've estimated this. About 60% of your kids' tuition could be 60% lower if you just stripped out all of these initiatives, because your kids are paying for this when they sign up for tuition. Nobody ever asks for a detailed list of all the fees, all that tuition money goes to fund stuff like this. There's a kid in Harvard University, a young man, an Indian immigrant at Harvard, has now made sure in the name of equity that women's feminine hygiene products are available in all the men's bathrooms and all the men's dorms. Because equity, because a man who thinks he's a woman is a woman, right? And so you're spending money to stock in the men's bathrooms female sanitary equipment. I can't think of a better word for that. Trying to be as delicate as I can here, right? So not succeeding very well. The University of Northern Colorado Center for Women's and Gender Equity offers support for both breastfeeding and chest feeding, the latter of which is a term used by transgender advocates to refer to trans men who breastfeed their children. One of my favorites, I hear this every day, and we heard it with Brett Kavanaugh. The fact that Brett Kavanaugh defended himself from slander is evidence for white privilege. The fact that Brett Kavanaugh got emotional and angry defending himself is white privilege. This is what white privilege looks like, right? The picture of Brett Kavanaugh crying. Staggering when you stop and think about it, but where does it come from? Amid widespread calls for a return to civility, especially when it comes to political differences, one professor took to Twitter to declare that calls for civility are just a cover for white supremacy. Simranjit Singh, who calls himself an anti-racist activist, argued that since Europeans colonized people they consider uncivilized, calls for civility are just an extension of whiteness and European colonialism. See, this is why you get the militant college kids. Why do these college kids think they get to follow you into an elevator and scream at you? Because you can't treat people civilized. Civilization, discourse, argument, debate, civil disobedience. These things are far too tame. These are symbols of white, racist, privilege, European colonialism. No, we just must fight. You do see, this audience of all audiences, you do see, this is unabashed Bolshevism, right? This is 100% the kind of thuggish Bolshevism that put Lenin in power. And these kids, like the disciples of Lenin, are too miseducated and too foolish to see the difference. Professor blasts environment for being too white and male. You would listen to the progressive, you would think the single greatest thing that we can do is leverage all of our first world values to apply environmental justice across the world. That everybody in the world, according to progressives, should pay a price, carbon taxes. We all should. But the environmentalists themselves are bothered because there are too many white men studying the environment. Too many white males are tarnishing the environment. A Yale University sociology professor argues that the green movement needs to become more inclusive and effective because white males occupy too many positions at environmental organizations. So simply the color of your skin now apparently pollutes the environment. To be a woke beta male on a college campus, probably in a man bun, that disqualifies you because you are an agent of racial harm because of your race and your man bun. And I'm with them on the man bun. Dr. Dorcetta Taylor discussed the troubling lack of diversity in the Green Movement, complaining about the lack of progress since she first identified the preponderance of white men as a problem in a 2014 study. Can you imagine getting tenure, lifetime employment, by writing an article which argues that male environmentalists are bad for the environment? Only people of color can effectively address the environment, evidently. So the problem here. We can multiply these stories 1,000-fold, right? But I go back again to my initial statement. There is not a major problem that we face as a country today that is not ultimately ginned up, manufactured, fabricated on some campus somewhere. 20 years ago, Barack Obama, in 2008, Barack Obama was solidly in the marriages between a man and a woman camp. So was Hillary Clinton. 10 years before that, universities were posturing. Universities were coming up with stories like this, right? And see how politics is moved by the university professors. What happens here to our kids when they go to these campuses? So I'll share with you some of my experiences, and it begins with a report Britt Hume talked about. Let's show this for a minute here.
Incoming college students overwhelmingly believe that slavery was invented by Americans and is an exclusively American phenomenon. That according to Professor Duke Pesta of the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, who spent more than a decade testing first-year students at 5 different colleges. In an interview with the website The College Fix, Pesta said many of his students, quote, came to college without the basic rudiments of American history or Western culture, and their reading level was pretty low. Pesta said on one quiz, 29 out of 32 students knew Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, but just 3 out of the 32 correctly identified him as a former president.
And that's true. Wonder why, as we become undeniably a more diverse country, as undeniably we have minorities and women in higher offices than ever before. We've had an African-American president, African-American justices, African-American secretaries of state. Why is it that as we become demonstrably more diverse, you think the left would be happy? But it's worse than it ever has been. And it's because of this. We are teaching your kids that America alone in the history of the world owned slaves. That's what I found in all of these quizzes over all of these years. I'll show you some of the results in a moment. The idea that I've got kids every semester, I've got them this semester, who actually are convinced that there was no slavery in the world before America or after it. When we talk about colonialism, you heard Mr. Singh say that white Europeans colonized the uncivilized. Well, who didn't? The Chinese did it with the Mongols, right? The Aztecs did it with all the tribes that surrounded them. But our kids learn it's only an American problem. This explains why our kids are so angry. They are so willing to rip down our traditions, our culture, our flags, our constitutions. Because all they know about American history is that the world's evils are its evils. And multiculturalism, the invention of socialists like Howard Zinn, whose textbooks have been in our kids' schools for history for 30 years. The idea here, now think about the flags. Okay, fine. I get it. If we're not going to train our kids to be historically, culturally aware, to recognize that the symbols of the past, if we see them again, they're reminders, they're not hate crimes. I get it. You want to move the Confederate flag, you want to pretend the Confederate flag meant one thing and one thing only, that's fine. But if you concede to that erasure of history, you know what you're doing, right? If the Confederate flag has to go because it flew over slave states, then the American flag has to go because it flew over slave states a lot longer than the Confederate flag did. And that's the point of getting rid of the Confederate flag. That's not the flag they care about. It's the one that's going to go next, right? And every argument you can make for getting rid of the Confederate flag is the argument you make for getting rid of the American flag, times 10. And you see how the creep of these kinds of ideologies work their way off campus and into popular culture. As far as my quizzes go, I called them cultural literacy quizzes. I gave these cultural literacy quizzes consistently for about 11 to 12 years at 5 different universities, Purdue, UT Martin, Ursinus College, Oklahoma State. I estimate conservatively that I administered more than 1,800 of these quizzes over that span. I gave them the first day of class before I even passed out a syllabus or told them my name. I just gave them a 20-question American history quiz. I needed to find out where we were, right? I administered more than 1,800. I didn't save all the paperwork over that span, but I did tally the numbers consistently. Here are some of the key responses. Excluding the United States, name one slaveholding nation or people over the last 2,500 years. Based on 1,206 responses, 80% of those students, 965 out of 1,206, left the response blank or indicated specifically they did not know. And these are Christian kids. I've had Jewish kids, Pharaoh and none of that stuff. Pharaoh and Moses, none of this sticks with them. 80% of these kids in the Midwest, the South, the East Coast, over all those years, did not know. And that's the problem. See, one of the glories of Western culture, one of its greatest accomplishments, Western culture, is we teach our kids about our warts and our flaws and our mistakes. We teach our kids what we've done wrong. To this day, Japanese high school students do not learn about the Bataan Death March or the rape of Nanking. Russian kids learn nothing about the depredations of the KGB. Chinese kids don't even know now what Tiananmen Square was. But we teach, and that's a hallmark of the greatness of the West. The problem is now, the progressives dominate the universities. In some departments like English, as high a number as 49-1. And I'm not talking liberal, progressive, and conservative. I'm talking liberal, progressive to moderate Democrat now. It's insane, the excesses of the numbers. And our kids are learning now. Though one of the main things that got me into talking about Common Core was now I recognize this. Mary, you helped me see it. Mary Black, longtime, lifetime Bircher and teacher, helped me see it. That what's happening now is you're pulling down that corruption of history into kindergarten, into first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. From the lowest levels now our kids are getting this kind of propaganda worked into their systems. It's called multiculturalism. And what is multiculturalism? It's basically the argument. Here's the premise. As Americans, Westerners, and white people, we are not allowed to criticize in any way, shape, or form non-Western cultures. So if Islam is much harder on women than we are, we can't say that. We have no authority to call out the horrid treatment of women in many Islamist countries. Who are we as white people, after all, to condemn a brown-skinned people? So we are not allowed to teach to our kids that in many parts of the world, the things that we are trying to get a handle on run rampant. There is a slave trade in southern Africa. Africans are being taken away to Islamic countries from places like Somalia. But we can't talk about that. All we can do is talk about our own oppression. So we're teaching colleges and universities now that are admitting girls at a 2-to-1 rate, that are handing scholarships to girls. In fact, it's ironic. Notice how you don't hear anymore claims that women are being discriminated against in college campuses in English or history or philosophy or sociology or psychology. There's only one area of study on a college campus now where, according to the left, women are underrepresented. That's the hard sciences. All you hear in a college campus is how the hard sciences discriminate against women now. So at my university, you got something called feminist biology. How's that sound? I brought this up in my class the other day. Feminist biology, explain that to me. Does biology somehow change or alter if you're a woman? And the answer now is yes. You could not get to a place scientifically where male and female don't exist if biology was run by boring white men. Couldn't get there. You needed feminism, radical feminism, as portrayed by men and women now, to infiltrate science and to point out now that your scientific facts are a holdover of racism. Logic, reason, the scientific method, empiricism, those four things have been branded a legacy of the patriarchy and white supremacy. You get rid of those four things, you ain't got science. You get rid of those four things, and Brett Kavanaugh doesn't need a single piece of evidence to be found guilty. It's not just feminist biology. Green chemistry, right? We'll study chemistry only within the parameters of environmental ideology. Feminist ideology overrides biology. Environmentalist ideology now overrides chemistry. and on it rolls. This is a particularly nasty one. When I point out I do it almost every semester, somebody brings it up, right? Slavery in America, and we talk about that. My goodness, do we talk about it, and we should. But I bring up inconvenient truths, right? Well, what about the Aztec? If empires are bad, and we evidently think they are, always and forever, well, what about the Aztec, the Inca, and the Maya? The depredations of all different peoples. There's not a race or a gender, there's not a part of the world that is free from the stain of tyranny or slavery or oppression. But our kids only know America's problems. Now do you see why they hate so much? And you almost can't blame them. They've been ginned up now at age 9 and 11 and 15 to either be ashamed of our history and culture or to hate it. And see, that's the trick of the left. You got two options with the left. You either hate yourself or you become like one of us. They leave you no middle risk. Brett Kavanaugh, right? Hate yourself, frat boy, for your privilege. Go away or leave it to us. Those are the only two options our kids are getting. Moving forward, circle all the following who served as President of the United States: Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Paul Revere, or Alexander Hamilton. Again, based on 1,206 respondents, 801, 66% only, figured out that Jefferson was a president. The poorest result when I gave this quiz occurred 3 times, where only 3 students out of 32 or 35 actually recognized Jefferson was a president. Benjamin Franklin was circled 60% of the time, Hamilton 40%, and even Paul Revere almost 30% of the time. Regarding Thomas Jefferson, circle each statement which is true. He was a general in the Revolutionary War. He defeated Lee in the Battle of Gettysburg. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He owned slaves. He was president of the United States. Again, a whopping 1,121 out of 1,206 students, 93% of American school kids, knew that Jefferson was a slave owner. That's what they knew. But again, only 62% thought he was a Revolutionary War general, 66% only could identify him as a president, and 40% actually thought he defeated Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, I can live with not being able to rattle off the presidents. It's hard to live with the fact that the one thing for sure our kids know about Thomas Jefferson is that he was a racist slaveholder. Now, our kids don't know that Jefferson tried to write slavery out of the Constitution. Don't know that. Try to give it a shot anyway, but they don't know that. Again, you see what accounts for the seemingly incomprehensible radicalness of our kids. Everything is better. Every measure of human life is better over the last 100 years. Lifespans, prosperity, nutrition, opportunity, education, technology. And yet you would think, listening to our college graduates and our high school seniors, that we're living in some kind of a toxic waste dump run by Nazis. In one sentence, define capitalism. 75% of the students, 3 out of 4 of them, define capitalism in part by using the words greedy, selfish, or unfair, or some unambiguously related variant. 3 out of 4. Does that explain now why almost 55% of millennials identify as socialists? Well, and this also helps you figure it out, right? In one sentence, define socialism. 85% of my students, 85%, use the words fairness or equality when discussing socialism. And you ask them something, tell me one meaningful thing, historical fact about socialism. They can't do it. They know nothing about the history of socialism. They can't name, many of my kids, about half, can't name a single socialist country, now or down through history. But they have been, I've gone to the trouble at times putting the words liberal and conservative on the board. and I point to the word liberal and I say, raise your hand if in all your 20 years of education you have ever heard that word used pejoratively, or you have ever heard a critique of liberalism. I have not in 10 years have I had one student raise their hand. I point to the word conservative. Raise your hand if you have ever heard that word used in a positive sense or had an argument made for it. 1 in 100 kids, maybe. And then I ask them a simple question. Can that be true? And you know, the most liberal of them shake their heads no. It can't be true. It can't. They know it. When they see it that way, why are you not getting the other side of the story? And that's how you begin to pull them back. And the funny thing about this is, it doesn't take but 2 or 3 months. The purpose is not to flip them politically or not to try to drive them away from one belief to another. I'd be, in many respects, as bad as the professors now are if that was my objective. I just want them to see that what they're being told can't be the only part of the story. It can't possibly be. And so we start asking them these kind of questions, right? Well, if that's not true, then why do you think you've never heard a critique of liberalism? And you can just sort of see them moving in the right direction. Our kids aren't stupid. They're just really, really miseducated. And think about how much money you're spending on that miseducation. It's one of the reasons we created Freedom Project, all right, to try to get a handle on this. So you got to cry, but you got to laugh first. It's a little sad stuff. So I figured we'd take some examples of bad student writing, some of it mine that I've gotten over the years, and kind of look at where these kids come at you from and where you have to meet them. To me, when I'm teaching these kids, my objective, again, is to try to get them to ask critical questions. If indeed you have been sold one side of an argument, can you think of an argument for the other? And they're pretty good about it, you know. One of the things I'm proud to say is most of my kids they think they're liberal. They all think they're liberal. It's like everybody thinks they have a sense of humor, and not everybody has. Every kid thinks they're liberal because they're rewarded for being so. But what I love about them is they'll come up to me and they'll say things like, this is the gold standard. I may have mentioned this earlier today. This is the gold standard question you get as a teacher. Dr. Pesta, why is it that I've been in school for 20 years and nobody has ever said these things to me before? That's when you know you're making a difference, right? And I say the fact that you asked that question means you have some studying to do, because there's got to be two sides to a story. But some of the goofy things kids will say. I'm a professor of the classics and Renaissance lit. Here's one. Socrates was a famous Greek teacher who went around giving people advice. They killed him. Socrates died from an overdose of wedlock. I like this one. I titled this one, I Didn't Even Know He Was Jewish. The Renaissance was an age in which more individuals felt the value of their human being. Martin Luther was nailed to the church door at Wittenberg for selling papal indulgences. He died a horrible death, being excommunicated by a bull. Gutenberg invented the Bible. Sir Walter Raleigh is a historical figure because he invented cigarettes. Another important invention was the circulation of blood. Sir Francis Drake circumcised the world with a 100-foot clipper. Shakespeare, I hate it when they do it to Shakespeare. The greatest writer of the Renaissance was William Shakespeare. Shakespeare never made much money and is famous only because of his plays. Slacker. He lived at Windsor with his merry wives, writing tragedies, comedies, and errors. In one of Shakespeare's famous plays, Hamlet rations out his situation by relieving himself in a long soliloquy. In another, Lady Macbeth tries to convince Macbeth to kill the king by attacking his manhood. Romeo and Juliet are an example of a historical couplet, of a heroic couplet. Writing at the same time as Shakespeare was Miguel Cervantes. He wrote Don Quixote. That's the video game version of the book. The next great author was John Milton, Milton wrote Paradise Lost, then his wife died, and he wrote Paradise Regained. So in other words, our unmarried undergraduates know what it's like to be married for 50 years. The government of England was a limited mockery. Henry VIII found walking difficult because he had an abbess on his knee. Queen Elizabeth was the virgin queen. As a queen, she was a success. When Elizabeth exposed herself before her troops, they all shouted, "Hurrah!" Then her navy went out and defeated the Spanish armadillo. Now this is my absolute favorite, because not necessarily because of what was said. I was just so proud of my response. I had a kid writing on the Roman Empire. He said, "The Emperor Tiberius fell into a comma and died." And I wrote back, "It must have been a very violent period." And he didn't get it. So I want to end by, again, thanking you for being here and reminding you that Freedom Project Academy is an important arm of the John Birch Society. Thank you. Every time I hear these beautiful stories about Robert Welch, who I obviously didn't meet, wish I had, it always comes back to education, doesn't it? When I think of the John Birch Society, it always comes back to education. Activism, politics, worldview, those are all subordinate to education. I think the John Birch Society is perhaps the preeminent educational organization in this country in how they do what they do, and how patiently and with what dedication and with so little reward they do what they do. And so you've heard a little bit, we had a little video before about Freedom Project and some of the connections we've made. Want to leave you with another short video. I had the good fortune of being interviewed by Glenn Beck a couple weeks ago. And our conversation, I think, will illustrate a little bit further some of the problems we face educationally.
Give you a real short anecdote. First day of class, kids were reading, this is just yesterday, kids were reading the first two acts of Measure for Measure, Shakespeare's great play, Measure for Measure. And so when we were talking about it, I asked them, I said, okay, so how'd you do? And one girl raised her hand and she said, look, it was very hard. I didn't really understand it. I said, okay, because no one's ever taught you to read Shakespeare. She goes, that's right. I said, so tell me what you took from it. She said, well, I could tell that the women were victims and the men were oppressors. And I said to her, how do you know that? She goes, honestly, because of my other classes. I don't know it from being able to read the play. And I said to her, have you ever read The Brothers Karamazov? She said, no. I said, right now, do for me a feminist reading of The Brothers Karamazov, even though you've never read it. The whole class laughed, and she looked at me for a second, and then she said, well, the men are oppressors and the women are victims. And I said, bingo. I said, to do the kind of progressive leftist readings that you are required to do in our English department, you don't even have to read stupid books anymore. You can just say what you said, and you have mastered, from our perspective, what we want you to take away from books, but you will know nothing about what the actual text said. And she agreed with me.
Wow, I wish there were more people like you in the university.
And what he said there, what we were talking about there, is absolutely, I think, the single biggest problem we have with universities, and no one's talking about it, is even when good books are put in front of your kids, these kids are being told, now don't worry about Shakespeare's world, don't try to figure out Shakespeare's language, don't bother studying 16th century history or religious philosophy. What I want you to do in this Shakespeare play is talk about, do a feminist reading. Or do a Marxism is huge. Do a Marxist reading of King Lear. Ignore the play, ignore its context, talk about how kings are evil, how the poor people suffer. We are forcing kids throughout the humanities and the social sciences to read, how did this happen? How did we collectively as a society decide that the proper way our kids are going to read books, even the great books of the past, are through lenses of Marxism or feminism or environmentalism or what they call queer theory, what they call queer readings of books. Ignore the culture, ignore their values, and read it from a homosexual perspective. This is what we're doing. And it's not just the humanities. Sociology, the social sciences, anthropology, they're all doing it. History, philosophy, theater, they're all doing it. And now, as I said a moment before, a few minutes ago, now they're starting to apply those lenses to the hard sciences. The hard sciences had been the last and only parts of our campuses to resist this. And now, feminist biology, green chemistry, all that now is beginning to work its way through. And you see it. The undermining of something as simple as gender, to do that, you have to ignore, neglect, and rewrite by. It's one thing to rewrite history, which is oftentimes subjective anyway, particularly old history. But now you're rewriting the basic facts of nature, anatomy, and biology to conform to their ideologies. When I said the word Bolshevik, this is Bolshevism. You may remember that Chairman Mao in 1948, when he took over and made communist China, one of the very first things Mao did was to drive the farmers into the hospitals. Took the pitchforks from their hands and at gunpoint made farmers perform surgeries on sick Chinese people, and they all died. And he took the doctors and drove them into the fields and made them shovel poop. Because the lesson from Mao was, there is nobody different, there are no distinguishing marks between science and farm labor. We are all comrades, right? That kind of staggering, and you know, there is something like that in what's happening to Judge Kavanaugh, isn't there? It doesn't matter what you did. It doesn't matter that you have a sterling judicial record. It doesn't matter that more people deny it than aver it. It doesn't matter that there's not a shred of truth or evidence for it. You're a man, you're a white man nominated by a Republican, you're a rapist, you're the victim, you suffer from white privilege, you are aggressive, you're hostile, you're angry, you're juvenile, and we can destroy your career. And looks like by one vote, sanity will prevail. But again, where we started, how long before sanity? How many more goes around can you have? And here it begs another question. Seeing the progressive left's reaction to Trump and reaction to what's going on, conservatives trying to govern, the hysteria, what do you think happens the next time Democrats control the House, the Senate, and or the presidency? Do you think they're going to return to normality? Oh, we control. You ever heard a progressive say this? Well, now we've got power, so let's scale it back, guys. Don't hear that, do you? So it's something to keep in mind. And I think all of this starts at school. All of it starts at school. All of it is manipulated by education. All of it is driven this way. I would, as a professor and a teacher, I would not want to see our schools and our universities as right-wing as they are now left-wing. I wouldn't want to see it. It would be just the same problem. The results of it probably wouldn't be quite as bad, but the same problem. But we are so far away from any sense of balance in the schools. And to answer, I think you kind of under your breath said, why would that be a problem? It's a problem because we don't want kids, this is why the left is becoming fascist, because the left has stopped trying to justify what it thinks. Because no one in very few people in universities are even around to challenge leftist ideology. Leftist ideology on common campuses, college campuses, has become such an intellectual monolith that they've gone to no one asks them to defend themselves. I mean, there's no defense for it. How do you make the argument that biology does not count for male and women? You can't. And no one's asking them within the halls of academia. Conservatives, meanwhile, in college campuses, if we're going to survive, we have to be able to explain everything we believe deeply. And if you just flip the roles and made them as monolithically right-wing as they are left-wing, you're going to have conservatism triumph, but it's going to be an empty conservatism, one that can't defend itself. We need critical thinkers, and trust me when I tell you, critical thinking is going to put them on our side more often than not. More often than not, critical thinking will drive them to us. Let thought do it. Let intellect do it. Don't do it by fiat. Make no mistake about it. We are the remaining adults in the room. We are the remaining adults in this culture. We can't resort to their tactics, but we've got to successfully find ways to fight them. And the first thing you got to do is make sure your kids and your grandkids are out of these toxic environments. Make sure that they're getting alternate narratives. Do you think you got to keep your kids in public school for whatever reason? Fine. Are you willing to spend an hour or two every night teaching them a different version of history to go with the one they learned in the classroom? Because you can do that. That doesn't cost anything. What are you going to do to make sure that we're giving kids a level playing ground? What I told you is exactly right. It takes me a couple of months of just asking kids why they think they know things before they begin to see that they've been lied to. It's not complicated. But the sad thing is that we're not doing it. We are not doing it culturally. Freedom Project was created through the wisdom and insight of people like Robert Welch and the Birch Society, who know how important education is. Robert Welch was always asking questions. I love the anecdotes. Always wanting to learn new things, always wanting to be pushed. That's how it has to be. And ironically, for a long time, American education did that. Doesn't do it anymore. And just notice how quickly bad education turns into bad behavior, and bad behavior turns into fascism and persecution. The John Birch Society, 60 years strong, dedicated and founded to fight those very things, and you keep doing it. Thank you very much.